in the grand, spectacular history of space exploration, we've seen humanity achieve the impossible. We've walked on the moon, we've sent robotic explorers to the farthest reaches of our solar system, we've built a floating laboratory that circles the Earth every 90 minutes. But let me tell you about a moment that is just as memorable, though for entirely different reasons. In 1965, an astronaut risked a multi-million-dollar cutting-edge space mission, the culmination of thousands of hours of work from the brightest minds on the planet. He didn't do it for science, he didn't do it for glory, he did it for a sandwich. A simple 2-day-old deli-style corned beef on rye sandwich. This isn't a myth or some tall tale told by old-timers at Cape Canaveral. It's a real, documented, and utterly fantastic piece of NASA history. The mission was Gemini 3, a critical test flight for the two-man spacecraft that would pave the way for the Apollo moon landings. The astronaut was John Young, a rookie on his first flight into the cosmos. He was a Navy test pilot, a man trained to handle immense pressure and make split-second decisions in life or death situations. But he was also a man who apparently had a profound disdain for the official, scientifically engineered space food of the era, which consisted mostly of unappetizing goo squeezed from tubes and rehydrated cubes of, well, stuff. So what does a brilliant, highly trained astronaut do when faced with the prospect of eating unpalatable food paste for an entire mission? If you're John Young, you don't just complain, you take matters into your own hands. You devise a plan so audacious, so wonderfully absurd, that it has become the stuff of legend. He decided to smuggle contraband aboard his spacecraft. The contraband in question wasn't a secret tool or a personal memento. It was a corned beef sandwich from a Wolfie's restaurant and sandwich shop in Cocoa Beach, Florida. This single act of culinary rebellion would go on to cause a surprising amount of trouble, generating more paperwork and stern-faced meetings than you could possibly imagine. The story of this sandwich is more than just a funny anecdote. It's a perfect illustration of the human element in the midst of sterile, high-stakes science. It's about the clash between rigid procedure and the very human desire for a decent lunch. This wasn't just any sandwich. After its journey, it became arguably the most expensive, most well-traveled, and most controversial corned beef on rye in the history of humankind. And it all started with a simple, sneaky idea. So how exactly does one smuggle a perishable deli item onto a state-of-the-art spacecraft? You can't just stick it in your pocket. Pre-flight checks for astronauts are incredibly thorough. They are suited up by a team of technicians who check every seal, every connection, every piece of equipment. Getting anything unauthorized past them is a serious challenge. But John Young had an accomplice, another astronaut named Wally Schirra. Schirra, a veteran of the Mercury program and a known prankster, was the perfect partner in crime. He was the one who went to Wolfie's and bought the fateful sandwich a couple of days before the launch on March 23, 1965. The plan was simple, yet brilliant in its audacity. On launch day, just before Young was suited up, Schirra slipped him the sandwich. Knowing that a full-size sandwich would be too bulky and obvious, the contraband had been carefully prepared for its clandestine journey into the void. Young, with the practiced calm of a test pilot used to hiding his nerves, tucked the sandwich into a pocket inside his spacesuit. It was a risky move. If discovered, it would have been, at the very least, deeply embarrassing. At worst, it could have been seen as a serious breach of protocol, potentially jeopardizing his place on the mission, but the allure of a real meal was apparently too strong to resist. The spacesuit pocket was the perfect hiding spot. It was a small, unassuming compartment, not typically inspected for illicit foodstuffs. The ground crew, focused on life support connections, unhelmet seals, communication links, would have no reason to suspect that one of their astronauts was packing heat in the form of cured meat and rye bread. The suit was sealed, the helmet was locked. John Young, along with his commander Gus Grissom, walked out to the launch pad. Inside his suit, nestled against his leg, was the little piece of home, a tasty rebellion against the tyranny of freeze-dried space food. The rocket ignited, John Young, Gus Grissom, and one corned beef sandwich blasted off into orbit. About 2 hours into the mission, with the Gemini 3 capsule dubbed the Molly Brown orbiting peacefully above the Earth, John Young decided it was time. The main objectives of the flight, which included testing the new maneuvering thrusters, were going well. This seemed like the perfect moment for a little surprise. He casually reached into his suit pocket and pulled out the sandwich. His commander, Gus Grissom, a seasoned astronaut and one of the original Mercury 7, was initially bewildered. "What is it?" he asked, peering at the plastic-wrapped object floating before him. "Corned beef sandwich," Young replied coolly. "Where did that come from?" Grissom exclaimed, a mix of amusement and disbelief in his voice. Young, ever the cool operator, simply offered his commander a bite. Grissom, perhaps intrigued by the sheer nerve of his co-pilot, accepted. He took a small bite of the contraband sandwich. The taste of real, earthly food must have been a welcome shock to the system after a diet of nutrient paste. He chewed for a moment and remarked that it was a good sandwich, though a bit dry from its 2-day wait. But then, the fundamental physics of a weightless environment asserted themselves with disastrous consequences. The rye bread, not being designed for zero gravity, began to disintegrate immediately. This is where the fun and games stopped and the real problem began. Crumbs. Hundreds of tiny, flaky rye bread crumbs began to break away from the sandwich and float gently throughout the cabin. In a kitchen on Earth, this would be a minor annoyance, easily swept away. But in the confined, high-tech environment of a spacecraft, floating debris is a serious hazard. The cabin was filled with delicate instrumentation, exposed electrical panels, and critical switches. A single crumb, drifting into the wrong place, could short out a circuit, jam a switch, or get sucked into the sensitive environmental control systems. Suddenly, this little prank didn't seem so funny anymore. Realizing the potential for disaster, Young quickly abandoned the culinary experiment. He carefully put the crumbling sandwich back into his pocket, but the damage was done. A small shimmering cloud of breadcrumbs now occupied the cabin with them, a floating minefield of potential malfunctions. For the rest of the nearly 5-hour mission, the two astronauts had to contend with these tiny rogue particles drifting lazily past their faces, and more worryingly, towards the complex instrument panels that were keeping them alive. The most advanced vehicle ever built by mankind was momentarily threatened by the flaky crust of a deli sandwich. Down on the ground at Mission Control in Houston, the entire exchange was broadcast over the Open Communications link. The audio transcript from the mission is honestly a classic piece of space history. When Young first reveals the sandwich, the Capcom Dick Slayton is on the line. He was one of the original Mercury 7. You can really hear the mix of surprise and humor in the voices. When Grissom takes a bite and crumbs start flying, you see crumbs drifting in microgravity. He then quickly says, "I'll stick it in my pocket," which is a pretty clear sign that he recognized the problem just a little too late. The initial reaction in the control room was probably one of stunned silence, followed by a few chuckles. The image of two of America's finest, heroes of the space age, munching on a contraband sandwich while in orbit was, well, just too absurd. These were tense, high-pressure environments, and moments of levity were honestly pretty rare. The Capcom's transmissions back to the crew stayed professional, but you can be sure that behind the scenes, there were raised eyebrows and shaking heads. The official mission log had a new and entirely unexpected entry: the consumption of a non-regulation corned beef sandwich. However, the humor quickly faded as NASA officials and engineers began to consider the serious implications. They heard Grissom's comment about the crumbs and immediately understood the danger. While the astronauts in orbit were dealing with the physical crumbs, the managers on the ground were dealing with the fallout. This wasn't just a harmless prank, it was a violation of carefully established flight rules. Every single item taken aboard a spacecraft is catalogued, sterilized, and approved, and an unauthorized object, especially an organic one like a sandwich, introduces countless unknown variables. What if it had contained bacteria that could thrive in the spacecraft's environment? What if it had caused an allergic reaction? The post-flight debriefings were where the reality of the situation truly set in. John Young had to explain his actions. While his intentions were harmless, the potential consequences were not. NASA administrators were not amused. They were responsible for the lives of the astronauts and the success of a program that carried the nation's pride and a significant portion of its budget on its shoulders. The corned beef caper, as it came to be known, was now an official incident. The story of the orbital sandwich didn't stay within NASA's walls for long. Once the mission transcript was released, the public got wind of it. More importantly, the politicians got wind of it. The incident escalated from an internal NASA matter to a subject of national debate. Some members of Congress were furious. They saw the sandwich not as a harmless prank, as a symbol of recklessness and waste of taxpayer money. They had approved a budget of billions for the space program, and here were astronauts playing fast and loose with the rules, jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar spacecraft for a snack. A hearing was convened by the House Committee on Appropriations. Yes, you read that correctly. The United States Congress held a meeting to discuss a sandwich. NASA officials were called to testify and explain how this could have happened. One lawmaker from the Midwest expressed his outrage. His constituents were highly critical of the agency for spending millions to test space food, and then the astronauts take along their own corned beef sandwiches. While Congress was fuming, NASA's food scientists were taking notes. The corned beef caper highlighted a very real problem. The early space food was genuinely terrible. The incident catalyzed a complete overhaul of NASA's space food program. The goal was no longer just to provide sustenance, but to create meals that were safe, efficient, and palatable. The primary lesson learned was the danger of crumbs. One key development, the tortilla as a space staple. Bread was out, tortillas were perfect. Tortillas didn't crumble, were versatile, and could wrap other foods, containing mess. Today, tortillas are a favorite on the ISS, a direct legacy of John Young's crumbling rye bread. So what happened to John Young, the man at the center of this cosmic controversy? Did this embarrassing incident derail his career? Not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. His skills as a pilot and engineer were too valuable to be sidelined by a single, albeit memorable, lapse in judgment. NASA recognized that he was an exceptional astronaut, and his career continued to soar to incredible new heights. John Young went on to become one of the most accomplished and respected figures in the history of space exploration. He flew in space a total of 6 times, a record he held for many years. He flew to the moon not once, but twice. On Apollo 10, he was the command module pilot for the full dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing. Then, as commander of Apollo 16 in 1972, he walked on the moon. In 1981, he commanded STS-1, the very first flight of the space shuttle. John Young was a legend. The corned beef story became a beloved part of his legacy, a funny footnote in an epic career. A single sandwich almost caused more trouble than the entire mission, and in doing so, it made spaceflight just a little bit more human. 10-minute story. Every day, a new pill of curiosity.